Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Well, on the ballot this November is a very important question, question 2. It talks about doctor-prescribed suicide, or the Compassionate Choices Hemlock Society calls it death with dignity. And today we have someone who's been fighting the battle all over the world in this regard. His name is Alex Schadenberg, and he's the international chair of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. Well, welcome to our show, Mr. Schadenberg.
Thank you, Brendan.
First of all, Alex, how did you get involved in this particular issue?
In fact, I've been involved for a very long time. I'm actually a Canadian. As the international chair, I've been involved, throughout Europe, Australia, Canada, U.S. on these questions. But I've been involved full-time on this since 1999, and these questions were being dealt with in Canada, and there were court cases. There was different deaths that had occurred. A case of a child who was disabled, who was killed by euthanasia by her father, and things like that. And there was so I got involved full-time, and I've been running the group now since 1999, yes.
Since 1999. Could you tell us a little bit about, some people, our viewers might be too certain about, how does euthanasia, how is it different from then assisted suicide, which is what Ballot Question 2 is all about?
Yeah, that's an important point, because Ballot Question 2 in Massachusetts is about assisted suicide, whereas euthanasia means that somebody, usually a physician, would lethally inject or directly cause your death by something they do, right? So lethal injection would be the most common way of giving that overdose. And that would be euthanasia, because someone's doing it to you. It's seen as a form of homicide. It's not legal anywhere in the U.S. to give someone a lethal injection, and it is legal, though, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and in Luxembourg. Those are the 3 places in the world where that is actually legal. But assisted suicide is a little bit different. In the case of assisted suicide, technically, the person causes their own death, but once again, they are provided a lethal dose. In this case, from the physician has prescribed them that lethal dose. And so what you have is a situation where it's similar in the sense that one person is directly and intentionally involved with causing the death of another person, right? The physician knows why they are prescribing a lethal dose. There's no accident about this. They know that they're being directly involved with causing that person's death. They're going to take that lethal dose and die. So that makes them similar. Of course, they're different by how they're done. They do coincide a little bit, and you see that in some cases someone might not be able to take the lethal dose. They might not be capable of ingesting it themselves, and then they would require somebody else to help them. And so the whole difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide in some cases becomes very blurry.
I see. Well, give us an idea. What is a lethal dose? Is it one pill? Is it what is involved?
Well, in this case, around question 2, it'd probably be more 100 pills of seconal, and seconal is a pretty strong drug. In much lower doses, it's been used throughout for many years as a sleeping pill in a much lower dose. So then what they give you is they give you 100 high-dose seconal pills. The difficulty, obviously, is that someone would have to consume those pills to die by assisted suicide, and so obviously there's sometimes, how would you say, a problem that way in a sense. But this is not what we call just, it's not like, having Tylenol around, or even pain-killing drugs around. It's a lethal dose, and it's significant. And usually it does, though, involve somebody else, not only then, obviously someone else prescribes it, the physician prescribes it, but also it often requires someone else to help them, because they need to usually empty the pills, and they usually empty them into applesauce or something, and then they consume it that way. That's because it's almost impossible to consume it any other way.
And let me ask you, it's the patient is supposed to give it to themselves. Aren't there situations that would arise where maybe he or she would not be able to?
Well, that's exactly the point. In fact, they've defined it as ingesting, and that is a very important point, because to ingest does not necessarily mean that they've taken it themselves. To ingest could mean that somebody else gave it to you. And so that could be, so long as you ingest it, right? So to ingest is how they've defined the whole thing. So there's a lot of gray area around this, whether or not some of the assisted suicide deaths become euthanasia. Nonetheless, the law is clear that if someone is giving you an intentional lethal dose, There's a lot of problems with this question of assisted suicide because we're talking about people in a very vulnerable time in their life. So once again, we're dealing with situations where someone usually is in fear of what their condition will come to, right? They're usually in fear of pain, or they're in fear of what their condition will become, whether it's because they have cancer or whatever it is. And so out of fear, they're seeking death. And what's happening now is, to legalize this means that doctors are now not only going to be involved with trying to keep you comfortable, trying to deal with your pain, trying to palliate your situation, which is what a good caring physician will do, but also to cause your death now, which just totally changes the role of a physician. It makes that whole relationship completely different.
Well, now, let me ask you a question. Say a person who had gotten the dose, the legal dose, happened to die, and he still had the legal dose at his bedside. Wouldn't that cause problems? Or could it cause problems?
Well, there's a big question, of course, because obviously some people who receive a lethal dose, so the first question is what happens. So they have to go, we should go through what happens with this. It's important to understand how there's so many problems with this. The concept that this could be done safely is really a misnomer in so many cases, because there's so many problems that could happen with it. So first of all, it requires a physician to prescribe, and then it requires a second physician to agree. So that seems pretty clear. And then someone will pick up the prescription from their pharmacist. And so it's usually somebody else who picks it up. The other thing about it, it has to be something that is agreed to, so you have to have it signed up, right? You have to sign up for this. You have to agree that this is what you want. And in doing that, the witness to the signature, one of those witnesses could be an error. And that's a real flaw in the law. To say that, oh, this will be safe for somebody, you have to understand, lawyers know that when somebody is doing their will, you're not allowed to have one of the heirs to the will be also the signatures as the witness, right? They have to be non-interested parties. But in this law, they allow an heir or an interested party to also be one of the witnesses. So that right off the bat would tell you it doesn't pass the stink test. So once they receive the lethal dose, there's no now further oversight. There's none. There's no further oversight. So that lethal dose could be sitting at the bedside table. Somebody might die in their sleep, and then you ask the question, what happens to it? I don't know what happens to it. That's a serious problem. You have a lethal dose sitting around, and what happens to it? We don't know. But even further to that, once they receive the lethal dose, it's not like it's sitting in a hospital medicine cabinet, which has got a security system over it. It's in your home. It's sitting there. Anybody could possibly take that lethal dose. This is not about a controlled situation. This is
a young child might mistakenly take it, or?
Well, the problem is anything is possible, because there's no further, here's the thing, there's no further oversight once you've received that lethal dose. What happens is you receive the lethal dose, and at a certain time in the future, you may or may not take it. Once you have died, what happens to lethal dose? I'm not sure. But once you've died, then the physician, by the law, is required to send in a report to the authorities about what happened. Rarely is the physician at the death. There's no third-party oversight, none at all whatsoever. And in the end, as I say, somebody might have that lethal dose mixed up into something and put into their, let's say they have an IV, it could be put into that. You don't know. We don't know. And that's the whole point. There's no control. And it's a very important point to remember. You can't say that this is about safety and this is about control and safeguards. It's not. It's about causing death. That's what it's about.
Well, my goodness, I'm just blown away now. Who sends in these reports to the state then? Who is the person? I mean, how are they going to report the death? Is it a death? Will it say suicide?
Okay, so you have a situation where the Massachusetts question 2 is very similar to what's already going on in Oregon and Washington State, and it's identical in how they've set up this reporting system. In fact, it's actually identical to the Netherlands and Belgium also. So what you have is a situation is when the person has died, the doctor who prescribes the lethal dose has to send in a report to the authorities. But as I've already explained, the doctor is rarely at the death. The death might have occurred 2 months, 3 months. Well, the person must be within 6 months of death according to the law. That's another big misnomer. How do you know when someone is within 6 months of death? I know I'm very candid about this. My stepfather, he had cancer in his liver, and he was given 6 months to live. He lived 2 years and 5 months, and most of that time he had a very high quality of life. The point of it is if this were legal in our jurisdiction, he would have qualified because he was within 6 months of death. The fact of it is sometime down the line, they take the lethal dose. The doctor might have only seen that person once or twice. We have to also understand who the doctor is who prescribes the lethal dose, because most doctors are not involved with assisted suicide. Most doctors may say, I'm not sure if I like this idea, or I don't feel qualified, or I don't know exactly how to fill out the paperwork. So what they do is they refer them to the assisted suicide group. So for instance, in Oregon, almost all the assisted suicides in Oregon are done by the group Compassion and Choices, which used to be the Hemlock Society, which was Derek Humphrey's group. That's who they used to be. So you have the assisted suicide lobby group as also the group that does the assisted suicide deaths. So now the doctor has not seen you very often, maybe once or twice, maybe 3 times, and now you have died. They have no idea who you are, and now they have to fill in this report. But I ask you the question, if the person was completely depressed, and according to question 2, if there's signs of depression, which is the same with these other laws, if there's signs of depression, they should be referred for a psychiatric assessment, but it's not required. It's not required, but it says in the law we have a safeguard, we will refer, right? The fact is if the person was not referred but was clearly depressed, or maybe they have early dementia and are really not competent, but the doctor were to have prescribed, are they going to self-report that they did something which was considered outside of the law? Are they going to self-report?
I would say no, they're not.
No.
They're going to lie on.
Well, why would you self-report when you could get in trouble?
Right.
The point is there's no
and lose your medical license.
You might. The point is there's no third-party oversight, and that's a very important point. The person who writes the lethal prescription is the person who fills out the paperwork after you've died, is the same person who was probably not at the death. In Oregon, for instance, there were 71 assisted suicides last year that were reported. Reported is important because not all get reported. But of the 71, only 6 times was a physician actually present at the death. So it's quite important. What's the actual information coming from this report? It's really to cover up, to make sure that there's no problems. If they wanted to truly be safe and have a safeguard, they would have said there needs to be oversight at the time of death, and there needs to be a third-party person outside of the act who actually fills out the paperwork and does the interviews and makes sure that everything was proper. But they don't have that, because it's not about that. It's about causing someone's death. It's about creating an avenue to have death. The assisted suicide lobby is interested in death.
Well, I'm a little bit unclear. Are you saying that the doctor that has prescribed the pills, he's going to be writing the report, and when he sends it into the state, is he listing the cause of death as assisted suicide?
No. So in question 2, it's exactly the same as what they did in Washington State. For some reason, because of privacy, they don't want people to know it was an assisted suicide. Now, I have to think this one through. I can understand privacy as being important, but if there's nothing wrong with assisted suicide, because that's what they're trying to say to us, there's nothing wrong with this, go ahead and do it, it's fine, that this is somehow about whatever. If there's something wrong with it, why do you have to list as the cause of death, whether that be being whatever your condition was, cancer, emphysema, whatever it is, they list that as the cause of death and not assisted suicide. I don't know why they've gone that way, because in fact what they're doing is they're turning the doctors into liars. In fact, then you have on this death certificate a lie. Person died of cancer. No, person might have had cancer. They didn't die of cancer. They died of lethal dose. It's very important to understand they died of lethal dose.
I would see where that would make a mockery of the whole reporting system of people that keep records and the legal profession.
The reporting system itself is not designed, as I say, to come up with information for us to be able to fill out the facts around this. The reporting system is to be able to secure a safety net. It's to be able to say, we have a report, everything adds up and everything's fine, but the report comes from the person who wrote the lethal dose. If there was anything that that person should have done that they didn't do, they're not going to report that because they might get in trouble. I'll give you an example. we just got major, I know this is a different issue, but it's somewhat identical again, it's euthanasia. The Netherlands just put out their big euthanasia report just a few months ago, which showed that in 2010 there was about 4,495 euthanasia deaths in the Netherlands. But the report showed that 23% of all the euthanasia deaths were not reported. Not reported.
Wow.
So then they say, oh, don't worry about it, you should feel safe and secure. Well, can we assure that every assisted suicide death in Massachusetts, even in this loosey-goosey system, is going to be reported even?
You can't.
You can't.
You can't. Well, now, the people, the proponents of assisted suicide, they talk a great deal about autonomy. Can you give us an idea what they're trying to push as their idea versus maybe what really goes on?
Well, we all want autonomy, right? We want choices. That's how we live, and we should want autonomy. I certainly like to have autonomy, but the fact of it is we're not talking about autonomy. You see, suicide possibly could be autonomy unless someone is mentally ill to the point where it really wasn't an autonomous act. Someone could possibly be doing an autonomous act when they kill themselves, but this isn't about that. This is about somebody else being involved. So the question is, now we're talking about what is the social reality around the question? Is this about autonomy, or is this about a person who is having difficulties in life and feeling pressured by others that maybe it's time just to end it? Maybe somebody is not really wanting assisted suicide, but their son who lives with them is saying, you know, Mom, I don't know how much longer I can care for you. There's all these other questions that come in. And what about depression? If this were truly about autonomy, there would be in question 2, it would say there must be a psychiatric evaluation. But no, it mentions a psychiatric evaluation, but it's not required. So therefore, it's just, how would you say, it's just ink on paper, right? It's not a real thing that we have to be concerned about. For instance, as I mentioned, in assisted suicide in Oregon last year, there were 71 assisted suicide deaths. Only one of them received a psychiatric evaluation, one of the 71, even though the law, like question 2, mentions that there should be an evaluation if there's a concern about depression. And yet, a study done by Linda Ganzini at the University of Oregon, which was done in 2008, that study showed that of her study, she looked at 58 people who asked for assisted suicide, and 15 of them she found were depressed. So 15 of 58 are depressed in her study. Now remember, because they're doing the study, therefore they get evaluated, and that's how she evaluates and finds that 15 and 58 are depressed. And yet, in the reality, only one person of 71 gets a psychiatric evaluation. So, you know, really, unless you're going to actually say we're going to eliminate depression as a reason, you have to realize that depressed people are going to be dying by assisted suicide. Is this truly about autonomy? The fact is, suicide might be autonomy, but assisted suicide is involving another person directly. It's involving people who are saying yes. In the end, the real question is, what is the motivation of the people around that person for why they're actually asking for assisted suicide? This is not truly about autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Now, also, we have the motivation of insurance companies, the medical community. I mean, couldn't they hasten a situation of assisted suicide?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to
make... Could they?
That's true. So let's make some distinctions first. And because it's important to understand that some people get a little bit confused around this and say, well, doctors are doing this already anyway, because you bring in the medical community. They'll say, oh, you know, we have doctors, they have to withdraw life-sustaining treatment. In different situations, somebody might be on a ventilator and they turn off the ventilator. Isn't that the same anyway? And the fact is it's not. It's not the same thing. There's a difference between withdrawing a ventilator and somebody dying a natural death because they are physically unable to breathe, or there's a difference between saying no to medical treatment and the person dies a natural death and actually giving them a lethal dose and they die of a lethal dose. There's a clear difference. So let's say, can doctors want to maybe save money? Well, we have I don't know exactly what your situation is in Massachusetts, but where I live, we have a serious problem because we have universal health care, and we have a serious problem with what they call cost containment. So with an aging population, there's been a growing need for healthcare dollars, and it keeps on growing, and so they're trying to find new ways to have cost containment. So if you're to legalize assisted suicide, obviously $100 for pills compared to treatment is there's no comparison. So the fact is, yes, there can be abuse going on that way. We don't know what everybody's motivation is, and that's the other thing. Someone says, oh, such and such wouldn't happen. Well, for instance, many of us have great doctors or have good family support, and others don't. Right? Others in our society might be well educated, have lived a good life, but now they're finding themselves in their later years alone and lonely. They're finding themselves in a situation where maybe their son only comes to visit them because he wants $1,000, or, you know, Mom, can you give me this? Can you give me that? Or, Mom, you're not doing well. I always wanted that. And that's the only time they come to see them. Or, Mom, I'd like to plan your funeral because really I'm going to be gone soon, and I have to. Like, these kind of, we think of this, but in the family dynamic, things happen, and that's the whole point. We can't assume that everybody shares an ethical reality that we would hope they share, because they don't. There's so many things that occur. Prime example is elder abuse. We have to understand that the statistics around elder abuse in the United States show that 2/3 of all elder abuse is done to people by the person that person is dependent upon. So it's a close friend, it's a caregiver, it's a family member, good son, good daughter. And what does most elder abuse happen to? It happens to wealthy seniors, mainly women, just a reality, and it is done to them by people who they are dependent on. And then we say, isn't it terrible that we have this serious problem with elder abuse and it goes underreported? The reason elder abuse goes underreported is because the person's afraid to report it. And then we say, oh, but we can legalize assisted suicide and feel comfortable that it's going to be safe. I don't think so. I don't think so.
And what about other vulnerable populations, like the minorities, the poor, the people
Okay.
that... What about some of those
It's a
other...
very interesting situation because
Because we've got the family dynamics,
Yeah.
the social situation.
You want to know, the facts are, the statistics show that the people who die by assisted suicide tend not to be minorities and poor people. It tends to be people who are white and well-educated and fairly well-to-do. And I think it's a very important point to remember. When we talk about things like coercion, assisted suicide, and concerns around that, you don't have to be poor. It's actually more likely that it's going to happen to you because you're not poor. It's because you actually have resources. The other thing is that we talk about this and say, you know,
But the elderly, I mean, some of them don't have resources, and, you know, they're going to say, with rationing, they're going to say, well, we'll just give them $100 worth of pills and they can kill themselves.
well, you know, there's going to be some pressure around all these situations. Once you open the door, anything can happen in the long term, and that's the important thing. The fact is that we need to be looking at how we properly care for people in our society. You know, the fact is that there's been amazing advances in palliative care and care for people that has occurred over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Today, people are dying in a far better, more comfortable way than ever before in history. And yet now we're talking about assisted suicide. And I think there's a lot of reasons why this is occurring. But the fact is that if we were to invest far more into how we care for people as they are dying, and I'm not talking about massive amounts of money, but redirecting some of our resources, rather than talking about assisted suicide, I think we'd be far safer in that situation. See, it's a natural situation. Someone might fear death. That's a natural situation. The question is society's response to that fear going to be, we will cause your death? And I think there's great concerns. You can't open the door to causing death and think that there's not going to be serious problems. It doesn't mean there'll always be serious problems, but there'll be some serious problems. So the fact is, will depressed people die by assisted suicide? Yes, some depressed people will die by assisted suicide. I mentioned the Ganzini study, and in her study, 3 of those 15 people died by assisted suicide. They never received a psychiatric evaluation. She acknowledges that the law is not capable of protecting people in that situation. What about people with disabilities? They're already feeling devalued. What about people with disabilities? I think it's very important that we recognize that everybody in society must be protected in these situations. That assisted suicide is not safe. It's clearly not safe.
Mm-hmm. Well, gosh, there's so much to talk about. Just one final question quickly. Does this change the doctor-patient relationship?
Absolutely. Right now, doctors are healers, and they're to heal or to provide care. But if they can become killers, there will be some of them who might abuse that. Mm-hmm. Some of them might. And you can't control. These are decisions that are being made behind a closed door. It's not about being wide in the open and having proper controls. As I've already said, this is not about control and safety. This is about causing death.
Well, folks, we hope you learned a lot today.
And vote no on 2.
Or to vote no on 2. There's so many issues here on this. If you look below the surface, and we hope that our guest today, Alex Schadenberg, provide you some knowledge and insight as he deals with this issue around the world. And we hope you found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.